quite some time off and on. I'm an independent documentary filmmaker, which means I operate on my own. So when I make my films, I raise my own money, I write my own proposals and treatments, I direct my films, I produce my films, and I see them all the way through completion. I've never started a film that I did not finish, and I don't intend for that to happen anytime soon. So up on the screen, as you can see, is just my basic information. If people want to write down my email address, my website, or any of my handles on social media, you can do so at this time, and I'll be mindful to put it back up there as we finish up, just in case anybody missed it or someone new walks into the room. All right, so I'm going to move on to the next slide now, and just share with you some of the films that I have made. So the first film that I made was a film, I should say my first professional film was a film that I made after I graduated from college. I made a student film that I did not include here. It was called Moving Memories. I made that when I was a senior in college at Northeastern University. Interestingly enough, I did not go to film school. As a student at Northeastern, I majored in journalism, radio and television broadcasting. I thought that I was going to get into TV broadcasting, be like maybe a TV anchor or reporter. And so I developed a relationship with one of my professors who was also an independent documentary filmmaker. They called him a guerrilla documentary filmmaker because he was really, really independent. I mean, he shot, wrote, edited his own material, and this was long before the term predators, people who produced and edited their own films. He was doing this back in the 80s and the early 90s. I mean, he would go to far off places, South America, Central America, South Africa, other places in Africa, and he would make these really incredible documentary films for PBS, and he was my broadcast professor. And so I took a class my senior year in college called Blacks in the Media and the Press. And I was exposed to a filmmaker by the name of Marlon Riggs. Has anybody heard of Marlon Riggs? I see you raising your hand up top. Marlon Riggs was one of the main influencers for me in terms of having a desire to make documentary films. I watched his films, Color Adjustment, Ethnic Notions, Black Is, Black Ain't, which is a film which was his final film that he did not actually finish on his own. He died before it was completed. That was his last film. He made Tongues Untied, and did he make Looking for Langston? Did he make that film? Okay, so those are his films, and he was an incredible, incredible documentary filmmaker, independent filmmaker. His works were very, very controversial. His film Tongues Untied focused on Black gay men, and it was highly controversial at the time. He made this film for PBS, and they almost shut PBS down because of the film that he created. I mean, they always look for ways to shut PBS down, but his film was particularly controversial in a lot of different ways. He focused on race, class, and gender, but also sexuality. He was a gay Black man, and he was a very, very brave, extraordinary storyteller. And I watched his works as a student, and I thought, wow, that's what I want to do. His films transformed me in the classroom. And so I wanted to make the kind of films that Marlon Riggs made. And I wanted to have that kind of impact on young people, young students, but also, a wider audience as well. So the first film that I made after college is called I Am a Man, Black Masculinity in America. This film took me 5 years to make, and sadly, it was rejected by PBS. It was rejected by the PBS system. It was technically flawed in a lot of ways. I mean, it dealt with a really, really important subject matter and topics that are very relevant even until this day. However, it was my first professional film, and it just wasn't. It was a really raw and crudely made documentary, and so that was my first film, and it got rejected from the PBS system, and I was really, really devastated by that. I was really disappointed because I put so much time and energy and effort into this documentary. It had something. I mean, there were some successes that came out of it. I mean, I showed it at a lot of colleges, universities, and high schools, and that sort of thing. And eventually, it actually got picked up by PBS, but not nationally. It got picked up on individual PBS stations around the country. So after I made that film, I was broke, okay, because I put my own money into it, and I needed a job. And so I got a job working at my old university, Northeastern. And I was working in the PR department, and it was strictly to make money. I really didn't want to do PR. I was just really trying to recover from the process of making a film, sort of being in debt and needing a stable income. And so I worked there, and every day I went to my office. You know, it was a nice office. It was, you know, had a pretty decent salary for a young man my age at that time. And it was a really safe job for me. Every day I stepped into that office, I kept daydreaming about my next film. I kept thinking about the mistakes that I made with I Am a Man, and I kept thinking about what I would do differently and the lessons that I learned. And I kept trying to, you know, figure out, you know, how I could become a better documentary filmmaker. And I sat in my office, and one day I realized that I was stealing somebody's opportunity to do what I was doing. In other words, I had this job as a PR person, but it wasn't my passion. And I recognized that PR was probably the passion of someone else who could be in my office, and I could be doing what I really wanted to do. And so after about a year, I made the very difficult decision and very scary decision to quit my job in Boston, strike out on my own. I moved back home to New York, and I connected with a filmmaker by the name of Stanley Nelson. Anybody know or have heard of Stanley Nelson? Extraordinary documentary filmmaker. And I called Stanley relentlessly. I called him at least once a week. Ironically, I was a reader for the National Black Program Consortium and their proposals. They had an open call where they had, like, you know, dozens of proposals come through, and they needed people to read the proposals. And so the way that I learned about Stanley Nelson is that I came across his proposal that he had written for a film that he was hoping to produce about Marcus Garvey. And so I read his proposal. Now I watched his work sample, which is this really incredible film about black newspapers, the history of black newspapers. And I was blown away by the film. And his proposal was the absolute best proposal in the whole bunch. And so I decided to tear off his information, his contact information, and when I moved to New York, I called him. And I called him every week, and he responded to me. And every time I called him, he would tell me to call him back next week. Right? And so I called him back the next week. And I did this for several weeks, and then finally he called me back and he told me that he was working on a shoot for the Marcus Garvey film that I had read about, and asked me if I would be interested in being a PA, a production assistant. And so I said yes. I jumped at the opportunity, and I got to that shoot probably at 5 o'clock in the morning. The call time for that shoot was probably like 7 a.m. I got there like 5:30 in the morning, okay? I was there early, ready to work. And that's how I formed a relationship with Stanley Nelson. And I worked as a PA on that project, doing almost every single thing you can imagine a production assistant having to do, from washing dishes in the sink, to sweeping the floors, to making copies, to doing all these different things. Because I wanted to be in the room and learn from a really seasoned documentary filmmaker. And I observed him. I observed, you know, his choices. I observed his workflow. I observed his relationships with his editor and his other crew on shoots, how he spoke to them, just how the shoots were supposed to go. I took everything in. And so finally, when that film was done, his film was done, they offered me an opportunity to work on their next film. And I really wanted to stay on board with them because I loved working with him and his whole entire team. But I decided that it was time again for me to, you know, strike out on my own and make my own documentary. And so I just went away, and I spent about 2 weeks locked in a room, and I wrote a proposal for this film. I don't know if you can't really see the mouse here, but my second film, Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes. Has anybody seen that film? Okay, a handful of people? Okay, cool. So Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes is a result of me having a really strong connection to Stanley Nelson, because I observed his process, and then I went off and I wrote my own proposal and treatment, and I made sure that it reached the same level of the same standard as Stanley Nelson had written his proposal, and I submitted to a lot of different foundations and that sort of thing. And over time, I was able to raise the money for that film, and I started working on Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes, and that film took me 6 years to make, okay? 6 years to make. And then the follow-up to that film was Soulful Junkies, which you can see down here in the corner, the bottom corner. It's the film that I'm going to be showing in just a little bit this evening. It also, well, I should go back for 1 second. So Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes, and this is a pretty, I don't know how I omitted this, but Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes ended up going to the Sundance Film Festival. I mean, it was my first, entry into a major film festival, and it doesn't really get any bigger than Sundance. And so once this film went to the Sundance Film Festival, it literally changed my life. I mean, for the next, I don't know how many years. I mean, I still show this film, but I mean, for a period of time, I was going all over the country in various parts of the world showing this documentary, Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes. And it eventually aired on PBS, and it had a very large audience. It received more than 1.5, 1.7 million viewers, something in that range. That's not, I don't think that's an accurate number, because it's been shown a couple of different times on PBS. And so I don't know exactly how many people have actually seen it, but it was in the millions. And then my next film was Soulful Junkies, which also debuted on television on PBS and has since aired on TV One 4 times over the past year in 2017. And this film also won Best Documentary at the CNN, they won the CNN Best Documentary Award at the American Black Film Festival and at the Urban World Film Festival. And the next film that I'm working on right now, which has been commissioned by ITVS, who I will talk about in a few minutes, is hazing. I'm making a documentary that is going to explore the culture of hazing. And so I started working on that film, I believe, in 2014 or so. And I still have a ways to go. And I'm going to show you a clip from that film in just a little bit. So the next thing I want to talk about is funding. All right, so several people raised their hand. They said that they want to make a documentary film. Well, you don't make a documentary film without getting money. Okay, it costs money to make a documentary film. And a long time ago, I asked Stanley Nelson about, fundraising, right? And how much money to raise for a particular film. And his response to me was, well, do you want a Mercedes or do you want a Kia, right? I don't know if those are 2 exact cars that he mentioned, or brands or models. But he said that really determines how much money you need to raise to get your film done. It really depends on the size, the scope, the bigness, how huge you want the film to be. Did I say bigness? Is that a word? Excuse me. How large you want the film to be. What the quality you want it to be, what you want it to look like, what you want it to feel like. That's really going to determine your budget. So over the years, I have been funded by the Ford Foundation, ITVS, which has been a major supporter of mine, the National Black Programming Consortium, which is now known as Black Public Media, has funded every single one of my films that I've made post-college. And for my hazing film, I've been funded so far by ITVS and NBPC, Artemis Rising Foundation, Impact Partners, the Wait Institute, the Kind World Foundation, and the most recent, well, also was funded by the MacArthur Foundation, and the most recent grant that I received was from the IDA, the International Documentary Association, and that was for their fund called the Enterprise Fund, and they funded 7 projects out of more than 350 people who applied for that grant. And so these are some of the usual suspects in the documentary funding world. Okay, so if you're interested in raising money for your film, these are some locations that you can tap into to raise that money. You all follow me? Mm-hmm. Right? So all you have to do is just type their names into your browser and go to their page, and there'll probably be a link that will say funder or funding or for producers, and you click on that link and then you figure out what you need to do next. Anybody have any questions so far? Any thoughts or questions? Yes.
What does that number look like?
What does the number look like?
The number regarding how much?
For a film, or how much these funders typically give?
Yeah.
Okay, so it ranges. Okay, so you have some funders who will, fund up to $350,000 for an independent film, depending on who you are. Okay, but in general, like so ITVS, for example, sometimes they'll give anywhere between $250 and $350. Okay, unless it's someone who has like a really strong track record, and they decide to commission them, and I'm sure it's much larger than that, right? That's why I said it depends on who you are. The Garth Foundation generally gives smaller amounts for independent filmmakers. MBPC is the same thing, so we're talking in like $25,000 to $50,000 range, $75,000 range. The Ford Foundation, I have received as much as $100,000 from them on a couple of different occasions. IDA was $75,000. Impact Partners was a smaller amount, but it was for a very specific purpose. So the amount of money varies depending on who you go to, and also depending on what stage you are in your career or your development. Yes?
When you apply for funding to these agencies, can you write your own salary in? Do you get to support yourself, or is it strictly for what's needed for the filmmaking?
For most you can. For most you can. Some have some really strict rules in terms of how much you can pay yourself and for how long. So for example, ITVS receives their money from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, CPB. So that means they get their money from the government, right? So they're always being audited, and they're always threatened by the government to have their funds, reduced or even completely taken away. And so they have to be very, very judicious about how the money is spent, and they have a lot of oversight in terms of how you use that money and how much money you allocate for yourself, for your own personal line item. One of the things that I did learn from Stanley is that you should always pay yourself. Okay. Now, in some cases, like ITVS and maybe a few others, they also have a cap, right? So if you say in your line item or in your budget for your line item that you're going to pay yourself $77,000, right, or $100,000, whatever it is, 90, whatever it is that you come up with that you can justify and that they approve, you can't make over that amount. Okay? So did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
How much was the first grant that you received?
The very first grant that I received? Okay. So the very first grant that I received was from the Echoing Green Foundation. That was my first grant out of college, and that was $15,000. But it was renewed, right? So I think they renewed me maybe 3 times, and then they helped me complete I Am the Man, Black Masculine Latin America. And so the total for that was somewhere around like $75,000 from them, but then I also got an additional $50,000 from the National Black Programming Consortium, and that helped me to get the film done. But that was my first film, and I shot and pretty much I did everything myself, right? And so I didn't really have to pay anyone, right? The money gets spent on your crew and for editing, right? And to pay for the shoots and to pay for production insurance. That's where most of your money goes when you're making a documentary. So again, going back to what I said earlier about what kind of film you want to make, the bigness of your film. I'm joking. Depending on how big you want your film to be, it's going to determine how much your budget is going to be, right? And, a lot of that's going to be contingent upon the size of your crew when you go out and you shoot, that sort of thing. How long you're going to be in production, how many shoots you have. Yes?
Do you have a
do if I dig into my files here. But you're kind of jumping ahead of me just a little bit, all right? I'm going to come to that in a few minutes. Okay? Yes?
Did you know how to write grants, or did you hire somebody?
No, I did not hire anyone. So, I mean, it's a good question. It's a good question. I have written pretty much all of my proposals, with the exception of this project. I actually have one of my producers sitting right here, Natalie Bullock Brown, and she has been helping me in recent months with sort of rewriting and submitting proposals to raise more money for my current film. But up until this film project, I have written all of my proposals. You know, I have people look at them, you know, to make sure that there are no typos and to make sure that it's clear, the writing is clear, and you know that it's a strong proposal. But I was a journalism major, and writing it just happens to be a strength of mine. So I've been able to get by for a long time with writing them on my own. And most of the time, I write and rewrite a proposal like dozens of times. Like the proposal for Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes, I think I counted about 26 different proposals that I wrote for the same film, 26. And coincidentally, just to let you know that none of this has been easy. Like I was rejected for that film like at least 3 times by ITBS before they actually funded it, right? So when you submit, you know, a proposal or a treatment to any one of these funders, you know, the percentage rate is pretty low for those who get funded. Like I told you, I mean, with the IDA, I was one of 7 projects out of 350. Okay, international. This is the International Documentary Association. So, you know, it's very, very competitive, you know, to get funded. Any other questions? Yes, I'm tired.
Do any of these typically have any quotas in their grant contracts that you have to pay them back, or they have to have input, or I mean, are you pretty much independent?
Well, that's one of the things I really like about being an independent filmmaker is that I have autonomy for the most part. However, it's a good question because with some funding sources like ITBS, there's a royalty share, right? So when you sign your agreement, you know, you negotiate your agreement, right? Which I strongly encourage that when you get an agreement from any funding source, that you have a lawyer look at it, right, and advocate on your behalf, so that you know you're getting the most that you can get, you know, from the agreement. And so part of the agreement with ITBS is that there is a royalty share, and the same thing with NBC as well. I'm going to move on. So the film that I'm working on right now is called Hazing, and I'm going to try. I hope that I'll be able to show you a clip here. Nope. I'm going to have to get out of this if I can. Go to my second. Are you all interested in seeing a clip from this film?
Yeah.
Cool. So this is a clip from Soulful Junkies. I'm not going to show that because I'm showing that later on tonight. But I will show you a clip from. As you can see, I have a whole lot of different cuts of the same film. Yeah, can you help me out a little bit? I'm actually almost there. So. Okay, here it is. All right, so the film is about hazing. Thank you very much, I appreciate it. So the film is about hazing. It's not about BGLOs specifically, although this particular character is a young African American man who plans a Black youth-led organization. His name is Brent. This, I just want to forewarn you, this is not color corrected and there's no sound mix here, so it's going to sound rough. But don't worry about it. It's not going to sound like that when the film is done. All right? So, take a look.
I do not think that people
Can everybody say that okay?
Know what they're getting into. Even if they know that there's physical, psychological, emotional, and spiritual challenges, there's no way that they can actually know unless they're actually in the experience.
I was in my dorm, and all of a sudden I hear a loud voice and somebody saying their name, and almost like he was announcing himself. And I said, "Man, who are you?" "Oh, I'm Brent McClanahan II."
Brent McClanahan II.
This guy right here, you know, that's me. You can tell I look real dapper. And then Bunny actually, you know, goes good with the socks.
Very friendly, kind,
Very courageous child, energetic, outgoing.
talkative to everyone.
He would say his name thousands and thousands and thousands of times. If anything was happening, whoa, 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 whoa. Reverend Cunningham II said, this is not how it's going to happen. We get it. We know who you are, Brent. A lot of laughs, a lot of traveling together, a lot of being together like all the time. We'd wake up at 10 and we wouldn't be apart from each other till like 10. And it was just fun, man.
My last name, McClanahan, just follows me in Bakersfield everywhere that I go. My dad playing for the Minnesota Vikings. Many doors were open. Enough for me. I would go out and about. People would know who I was because of my last name. This is exactly where everything took place. This is where I met the Kappas at.
I've always thought the Kappas were distinguished.
There were just so many different events that just changed my life forever. I was always surrounded by Kappas in my home. Always. It was just every weekend, you know, there would always be a Kappa that was over at my house, my parents' house. My dad was the dean, so, you know, he had different lines that he brought through.
I had a group of young men that I was pledging to be Kappas. At the same time, she was pledging AKA. We were both active in our fraternity and our sorority.
Growing up as a kid, I see bricks, red bricks, the big old paddles, you know, on the wall, and I see the canes, and, you know, all those symbols as you're growing up kind of like had a really big impact on me. And I just started to fall in love with it. My dad bought a CD, and I would play that CD, that Kappa CD, until it just was warped. I mean, I just loved it.
We're a Greek family, and it was like welcoming another Greek, my son, into the Greek family. I was excited.
When I made mine, I felt amazing. I felt great, you know. I was like, man, this is it. You really have it in your mind that you know something's going to happen, but you just don't know what's going to happen. You know that your big brothers is going to do something to you, but you don't know exactly what they're going to do to you.
A set is a pledge practice where all of the people who are online and who are pledging goes to a designated spot where the people who are pledging them are there to challenge them mentally, physically, emotionally, psychologically. They're trying to build a bond amongst the members that normally takes years and a lifetime to build within a short, concentrated period of time to make this line, quote unquote, one.
There's been an underground pledge process that has been created by the fraternities and sororities, particularly on the college level. And so what happens is that the validation comes from the underground pledge process. You will be looked upon as being a real member because I had to go through something tough. That's tied into a whole bunch of different things that the young people are coming to the college campus seeking.
Tell us about the house that we're approaching right now. This is the house I was raised at every night. Which house? That one right there.
cut.
The cut.
Right, what you said?
Everyone take their shirts off.
Back up.
Hoodies and shirts.
Oh yeah.
Get real. Get real.
Yeah, there. Look at that.
When I tell you, set it at a certain time, y'all need to be here. I don't give a fuck what y'all doing. I'm gonna be not gonna.
Okay, Cardell bought this, huh?
Damn, that motherfucker's
Who videotaped this anyway?
Our AD videotaped it all.
Okay, why would they videotape it, and how did you get access to this video?
My AD said that the reason why he made it was because we needed to make sure we had some, like a photo book, you know, to make sure we can sit back and go through, this is what you went through, this is how good you guys were. And to have, you know, this is
The validation.
The validation.
The
right.
validation part.
Right.
Yeah, so you can relive the fact, because the whole point of it is supposed to be where you actually turn around and you have a memory that suddenly changes once you initiate it.
Ass up. Ass up. Back now. Back.
All right, that's it. That's enough.
Thank you.
Any cappers in the room? Anybody any cappers in the room? Show my hands, anybody?
Anybody want to be a capper?
You might want to be a capper. Well, I'm a Q, so I have something at stake here as well. Okay, so now I gotta figure out how to get this my PowerPoint back on the screen. Okay, I think I got it. I think so. What are you doing?
Are you guys great? Everybody my feelings. Are you? No, no. No. Criminal kill me. You just too. Which is a different experience.
Okay, we're back. All right, cool. Can everybody see? All right, so that's just a really short sample of the film that I'm working on. Is it something that you will watch on television? Is it something that you were hanging there with? Okay, cool. All right, so now I want to get into like the real fundamentals of how to make a documentary film and how to get started. Carla, how much time do we have left?
We have about 10, 15 minutes.
All right, so basically, if you want to make a documentary film, I'm going to go through this as quickly as possible. I think it's really, really important to get your idea, whatever you have inside of your head, out of your head. You got to get it out of your head and you have to commit it to paper, all right? So I always encourage people who come to me and they say, I want to make a documentary film, but I don't know how to start, right? And I ask them, have you written your idea down? And they'll say, no. And I say, well, that's the first step. You have to actually write your idea down, and I suggest that people begin with writing a one-page or one-pager describing their film, and then expand that to a 3 to 5 page treatment, okay? And so if you're treatment challenged, like you asked me a question about whether or not I've written my own treatments, I suggest you reach out to somebody like myself or another filmmaker who has done it before and ask them for a sample. The only thing they can do is say no, or they can say yes. So there are two things they can do. They can say yes, or they can say no. Some filmmakers may be a little territorial about sharing their treatments. I'm not. Like if I've already made a film, like Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes, for example, even Soul Food, if somebody reaches out to me and say, can you give me a sample treatment, I will, more than likely, I'll just share it, right? Because the film is already made. Okay, so the next thing that is very important is, so in terms of the actual treatment itself, okay? One of the things that funders often ask for, not all of them do, but many of them do, is they ask for your rationale. Why are you making this film? What is the visual treatment? What is your film going to look like? What is it going to feel like, right? These are things that you're going to have to explain in detail when you're writing your treatment. Y'all hear me? Filmmakers? Aspiring documentary filmmakers? Okay. Are you taking pictures and writing down notes? Because this is the real deal here, okay? This is what it's really like to have to write a treatment and submit it to get the kind of money that you would want to make a documentary film. Another thing that funders want to know is your story structure. Okay? How do you plan to tell the story? Will it be a 3-act structure? Is it going to be a first-person documentary? Is it going to be cinema verite where you're just following your subjects or your characters as if you're a fly on the wall? Will it be experimental? Will it be a hybrid? Will it be, documentary, but also feature some elements from fiction films? Will it have reenactments? What is the film gonna entail? What's the structure of the film gonna be? Those are all important things. And when you're writing these things, you have to be very descriptive. So you have to use your creativity and your imagination, you know, because when you're making a documentary film, lots of times you really don't know what's going to happen, right, before you start shooting. So you basically have to conjure it up in your mind, right, and you have to explain what you envision your film to look like. And I think it's good too because, you know, by doing that, you're actually taking the time to think about what your film is going to be from beginning, middle, and end. All right? Let me see. Did I skip one? All right. So the next thing would be okay, your audience. Okay, who's your audience? Who's your target audience? I hate that question. I hate it, because I always like to think that my audience is like the world, right? Like I want everybody to see this film, right? And I think if people got in front of my film, they're not going to want to walk away from it, right? So I'm always thinking that my audience is like this huge demographic. But in reality, you know, it does make sense to really sort of narrow your focus and kind of really determine who you're speaking to in this film, right? And that helps a lot of, you know, it helps for a lot of reasons, right? It helps you to figure out who your storytellers are going to be if you're communicating to a specific audience. It helps the funders understand, you know, who you're thinking of in terms of the audience because they want your audience to be their audience, right? So that's why that's an important question to answer as much as I just stated. And then you have to think about marketing and distribution. How are you going to get your film out into the world? That's very important. A lot of funders want to know whether or not you have an engagement or impact campaign. How is your film going to make an impact? What communities will you engage and how, right? What partners are you going to include in your community engagement plan? Right? Are they going to be national partners? Are they going to be local partners? Impact is a really big deal for a lot of funders because they want to know how their films are making an impact. You know, how they're making a difference. Okay. Next, budget. You mentioned the budget. Okay. I always suggest that you shoot for the stars for your budget, but on the way down, grab the more. Okay. If you can't get all of the money that you want to raise, you know, raise as much as you can. And right now, to be quite honest with you, with my Hazen documentary, I am in a challenge. I've raised a significant amount of money. I've raised more money than my previous 2 films, but I haven't met my goal yet. So I'm just like any other independent filmmaker right now who's trying to get his film done, right? And so the question is, are you going to persevere? Are you going to stay the course? Are you going to follow, you know, your vision, your heart, your mind, and continue on to sort of raise the money that you hope to raise to make the kind of film that you want to raise? And it's a real personal challenge because, you know, it's a struggle to raise the money. It's not easy. You know, you have a lot of people competing for very, very limited funds. So you have to, you know, you have to really be determined and focused and have a plan and stick with your plan. Okay? Very important to know the range of your funder. You ask the question, how much do these funders provide? You have to do that research. You have to go and say, okay, they only give out $25,000 to $30,000. You can't go to them and ask for $150,000, right? You know, that's an indication that you haven't done your homework and that you're inexperienced. Because an experienced filmmaker is not going to come to them and ask them for more money than they have at their disposal to give out, okay? Again, if you're budget challenged, you don't know how to deal with budgets, you don't know how to work with budgets, you don't know how much to ask for, ask someone. Ask someone who's been there and done that, all right? I have various sample budgets that I have accumulated over the years, and I always use that as like a source, right? To know how, like what line items I need to be asking for, right? And how much, like what's the range of all these different things. After a while, you kind of pick it up and you kind of know what the range is. But if you're just starting out, it's really important to get a sense of what's realistic. Like what is a realistic budget? Yes, you had a question. Did you have a question?
Yeah, regarding the hip hop documentary and dealing with that type of clientele, like the rappers.
Yeah.
Did they request funds?
No.
Okay.
No. They ain't asked you. Okay. So you asked the question earlier, do you pay yourself? right? Yes, the answer is yes. Do not sell yourself short. You know, there are plenty of filmmakers who spend a lot of time and invest their own money in their own documentary films, and I don't advise it. You know, I advise that if you're going to make a film, raise the money and have somebody else pay for your film. Okay? Also, it's important to make sure that you pay your crew the going rate in your field or geographic location. And I always, you know, highly suggest that you allocate funds for a good editor and a good shooter, because those are the two key positions on your team that are going to help you make a really good documentary film. You understand what I'm saying? The editor is critical. Who you choose as your editor is critical, because you want someone who's going to be able to take what you've shot, right, and then be able to discern what rises to the top and what doesn't rise to the top. And they have to be qualified and strong enough to be able to know the difference and be able to tell you, be honest with you, when something is working and when something is not working. Because as the director, you think that everything you shot is great, right? But the editor is going to be like, nah, that's not working. It doesn't work. We need more of this. Do you have more of that? You know, what we're missing is this. We need this perspective, right? Because you're going to be working with your editor to create a story arc, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And as a result, you know, you need to have somebody, in my opinion, it's important to have an editor who has a strong sense of story, beginning, middle, and end. And so I always say, like, if I can find like a really qualified editor, I'm willing to pay more for that editor, because I know that editor is going to make a really great film for me, okay? The same with the shooter. The shooter is very, very important for many of the same reasons. Anybody have any questions before I move to the next slide? Okay. Plan for production, okay? Pre-production is very important. This is when you lay all of your plans for production, when you do all of your research in terms of who you're going to reach out to interview or to shoot. This is where you get all of your ducks in a row before you go out in the field and you start shooting interviews and start shooting material, because you want to have a real strong sense of what you're shooting and why. Okay? One of the things that Stanley told me, and has told me many times, is that if you go out and you start shooting without a plan, right, more than likely you're going to try and fit that footage in, even if it doesn't work, because you shot it, right? So in other words, it's important to be very intentional about your shooting, who you're shooting and why. Making sure that if you're trying to include various perspectives, that you are covering all of those perspectives, so that you have a film that is, you know, whatever it is that you want, a film that's nuanced, a film that has multiple points of views. It may have opposing point of views, right? You want to make sure that your film is dynamic. You don't want the same people talking about the same thing. Have you ever watched a film that just seems like it's just reiterating the same point over and over and over again, and it's like 2.5 hours long, and you're forced to sit through it? You can avoid that by planning as a filmmaker. You don't want to hold your audiences hostage while they're sitting in their chairs, like many of you may feel right now. And then you want to flesh out your vision. Flesh it out. You know what I mean? Like really try and figure out, okay, what it is that I want this film to be? What is it that I want this film to be? And what does it look like? You know, how's it gonna feel? What do I want my audiences to feel? What do I want my audiences to walk away with? And this is when it becomes like a real struggle for a filmmaker. You know, because you have to make choices and decisions. Sometimes you have to make really difficult choices. There's 10 different ways to make one film, right? Maybe more than that. You know, you get 10 different filmmakers in a room and you have them make a film about the same topic. They're gonna look totally different based on that person's vision and the choices that they make. And in pre-production, you also select your characters and your talking heads. All right, everybody with me? Any questions? Okay. Also in pre-production, you got to decide on your visuals. Okay, what is your film? You can't just have a film with talking heads one after another, right? You have to paint your film, so you have to think visually. That's also important for your treatment. right? Because your treatment has to be descriptive. You want to give your funders a sense of what the film is going to look like, right? Because if they can't imagine it, then they're going to question whether you can imagine it, right? And you know, a lot of times I have conversations with people, and they may not get my vision, like they may not get what's in my head, and they're not supposed to because it's my head. We all have, you know, our own individual brains, and it's hard to get people to read your mind. That's why, that's the magic of storytelling. That's the magic of filmmaking, because you're taking something that began in your head, in your brain, and you're translating it to a screen in which everybody's gonna see what started out in your mind. That's, to me, that's the beauty of documentary filmmaking, or filmmaking in general, that you can actually conceive of something and then turn it into a product that people actually experience and feel. You know, and that's the challenge of it too, you know, is getting to that point. So during pre-production, you select your crew, you set up interviews and your shoots, and typically if you have the money to pay for an associate producer, that would be the role of an associate producer or a producer, depending on how big or small your team is. And that person would do the job of going out and setting up interviews and setting up the shoots, which is, you know, it takes a lot of coordination, it's a skill, and you kind of have to know how to sort of manage that. And finally, prepare, right? You want to prepare as much as you can before you actually go out and shoot. So in terms of production, okay, that's a different phase. So you have, I didn't talk about R&D. Right? But R&D is a whole, that's a phase that comes before pre-production. R&D is when you do all your research. Pre-production is what I just described. Now we're heading into production, okay? And during production, this is where you do your primary shooting, your principal photography. This is where you gather your footage, your B-roll. You know what B-roll is? Anybody know what B-roll is? Mm-hmm. Anyone B-roll? Huh?
B-roll is the additional footage outside of the interviews that might highlight what might be being said.
Absolutely. So in other words, if you have, I mean, my old instructor used to always say dog, see dog, right? So if somebody's talking about something, you want to see what they're talking about. You don't have to be that literal, right? But you want to be able to, as I mentioned earlier, paint your story, right, with visuals, with images. Other footage could be like file footage, archival footage, if it's a historical documentary, right? You have to acquire file footage to help tell your story. So if you're talking about Black Oklahoma, right, the history of Black Oklahomans, right, you got to do a lot of archival research to dig up that material. You know, the other day I was watching this little clip on Facebook, and it revealed like footage of Tulsa, Oklahoma before the bombing. Has anybody seen that? I've seen it circulated a lot. And it's like all this old archival footage that's very rarely seen of what that community looked like before the bombing and then after the bombing, right? So that's the job of archival footage. It's to take history and bring it to life, okay? Once you go out and you shoot all this footage, you have to convert the footage. You have to keep track of all the footage that you've shot. Then you have to transcribe your interviews, right? Because if you interview subjects, you know, talking heads, you're watching a documentary. Let's say Ava DuVernay's 13, right? See all of those people that she interviewed who were very knowledgeable about mass incarceration and the criminal justice system. Somebody had to sit down and verbatim, right, type every single word to every single talking head that she interviewed. And this is what happens with my film as well. I take the footage, I send it to a transcriber, and they transcribe the whole interview word for word. And the reason why that is important is because it helps you through your editing process. So you don't want to be fishing around for material. You want to be able to know exactly what someone said, and you want to be able to go to that exact soundbite, because the whole thing is time coded so that you can find it quickly and you can work with your editor. Reviewing footage is very, very important that a documentary filmmaker is very familiar with their footage, because again, that helps in the editing process. It's always good if you need, so in other words, when you're having an exchange with your editor, and your editor is struggling with something, he needs a soundbite, he needs a point of view, or POV, or he needs something to transition or to bridge to another character or another scene. Where reviewing your footage comes in is when you can recall very quickly someone who says something that fits into that gap, like a piece of a puzzle. You understand what I'm saying? So the more familiar you are with your footage, the more quickly you can recall any kind of material that's going to help you fill in gaps or give you what you need to help tell your story. And then once you review all your footage, you have to make selects. And when you make selects, you're basically selecting the very best of what someone says or the very best of your raw material. Okay? So you basically go through the material, you have your transcriptions, you have your logs, and then you're watching, and then you just circle or you just make a note of like what's working for you, what stands out. Are y'all with me?
Yep.
All right, cool. And then post-production. Did I go too fast? You want to take a picture or something?
Now I got this.
Okay, cool. All right, so now we go into post-production. I'm going to begin wrapping this up. You go into post-production. This is when you really begin to work with your editor, okay? You continue to review footage. You create what is called an assembly. An assembly is just like a long string together of all of your best footage, right? This is how, so most people, when they go out and they shoot a film, you're shooting hours of material. You're shooting, sometimes you shoot over 100 hours worth of material. But you gotta make a film that's 56 minutes long or 75 minutes long. So how do you get to that point? You have to create an assembly, you have to select the best of the best material that you have, and then you slowly have to start truncating it and whittling it down to what they call an assembly. And usually, if you're making a 1 hour film, your assembly is going to be very long. It could be like 2.5 hours, right? It's your best stuff. And that's when you begin to show it. You talk over the material with your editor. And that's when you start to begin really kind of like chiseling down at the art, right? At the piece that you're creating. And, that it brings you a little closer to the finished product. You have to write narration if there's going to be narration. Some films don't have narration. Some films, documentary films, have the characters tell the story. Some films like mine have personal narration. Stanley Nelson usually has like a narrator. I just watched a really great film at Tribeca 2 days ago, Sunday night, about this brother named Ellis Hazler. The name of the film is Mr. Saul. Blair Underwood was the narrator, right? But somebody has to write the narration for Blair to read it and perform it. So you have to write narration. You also have to create rough cuts. I'm a stickler for rough cuts and reviewing rough cuts. Rough cuts are extremely important because, you have to begin to like make decisions about what's going to make it into the final film. Okay? So when you review your rough cuts, I typically have a whole team of people who will sit down and watch my rough cut together and give me really critical feedback. And I ask people to be as hard and as honest as humanly possible. All right? Because I want my process to go through the ringer, and I want it to, by the time my film gets on a big screen like this, I want it to be battle tested. So that when people like you sit down and watch it, you can't say nothing about it. All right? I mean, people are always gonna say something about your film, but you wanna minimize that as much as possible, okay? Because at the end of the day, when you sit down and you watch a film, from the minute you start eating your popcorn, like this sister had this popcorn a little while ago, when you sit down and you watch your film, or somebody watches your film, from the very first frame, they are judging it. And they are judging it harshly, okay? And so, I always need to have like a middle person or middle people to kind of get me to that point before people are gonna be harshly criticizing my film, okay? Then you create a fine cut, you review your fine cut just like you did your rough cut, you create a score, you finalize your fine cut, you lock picture, meaning that's it. What we got is what we got as a film. We're not going backward. We're not taking anything out. We're not putting anything in. This is it. This film is locked. This is almost a wrap, okay? You lay in your final music. You record your final narration. You lay in your final narration. You color correct and color grade so that the images pop on the screen or on television. You have a sound design and an edit, and then you output your master, and then you show your film. All right? And then you submit to film festivals, whatever film festivals you think are the most appropriate for your film. You have a theatrical run if that's what you want. You have a television broadcast like I've had. And then you have to really think about and you have to consider what kind of digital distribution you're going to do, whether it's Netflix, PBS Video, Quayle TV, which is a black Netflix, basically, iTunes, Amazon.com, whatever platforms that you want your film to be distributed on. And then hopefully you have a successful run. You have a successful film, your film reaches millions of people, and then you can say, I'm a filmmaker. That's it. Any questions? Any questions? Any questions? Yes. I saw your hand first. Yes.
With your hazing documentary, is there any thought of reaching out to the Divine Nine and help with that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's like one of the first places where people suggested I go. But there are two things to consider. One, I'm making a film that's critical of some of the behavior of members in the Divine Nine, even though my film is not simply about it, okay? And then the other thing I have to think about is whether or not receiving money from the Divine Nine would be considered as a conflict of interest. So is that money going to shape or influence the editorial content of my film? And I don't want anyone to be able to suggest that. So I have to be very careful about the source of my money. Okay? You had a question? Somebody, you had a question. You're good? Up top.
What is the documentary filmmaker's responsibility for showing multiple viewpoints? Because you've got 100 hours of footage.
Yeah.
And you're trimming it?
Yeah. The responsibility to show multiple points of view really depends on you as the director and the kind of film that you want to make. So, and also some funders require that you have multiple points of view, because otherwise it becomes an advocacy film, right? Where you're advocating one perspective. And so from their standpoint, they can't be seen as taking a side on a particular issue. And so, I think it's important to include multiple points of view for your film to have credibility with your audience, right? To show that you're making an attempt to be balanced. But again, it depends on the kind of film, and depends on the kind of the style of the film. So if you're making a film that's very personal in nature, and it's about you and your experiences, well, then you may not need to have alternate perspectives on that. But if you're making a film about the Vietnam War, like Ken Burns, right? It's a 10-part series. Then you have to have people who are supporters of the war, and then you have to have people who are opponents of the war, right? In order for the film to have any sort of historical, I guess, credibility. Any other questions, comments, thoughts, suggestions, ideas? Thank you all very much. I hope you come and check out my film. I hope you stay and check out the film. It's going to be in this particular space. Thank you so much.